In May of 2007, Ayaan Hirsi Ali came into the studio to record an interview with me about her memoir called Infidel. Feel free to leave me a comment and let me know what you think. From the studios of Radio Fairfax, just outside of Washington, D.C., this is The Mimi Gerges Show. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was brought up to be a good Muslim. The daughter of a Somali resistance fighter, she was raised in a strict family that taught her to submit to her parents, to her clan, and above all, to Allah. But at the age of 22, she escaped from a forced marriage and sought asylum in Holland. Her journey took her away not only from her family, but ultimately from Islam. In 2004, she was elected to the Dutch parliament, where she pushed for the reform of Islam and for the rights of Muslim women. But as she became more vocal and outspoken, Muslim extremists threatened her life and she went into hiding. Ayaan Hirsi Ali left Holland and now makes her home in the United States. Her memoir is called Infidel, and she joins me in the studio. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on.
Everywhere you go, you have armed bodyguards protecting you. How long has this been going on?
This has been going on since November 2002. Actually, September 2002, when I first went to the police because of threats in the Netherlands.
Now, your name became internationally known after the murder of Theo van Gogh by a Muslim fanatic in Amsterdam. The two of you made a film together called Submission. Can you tell us about the movie and how it came about?
I had been approached by Theo van Gogh because he was asked in May 2004 to chair a meeting, and he was chairing that, and he used to do that very, very well. Was a prominent figure in the Netherlands. The debate was about Islam and the multicultural society, and a young man from Belgium, a Lebanese Belgian man, was invited called Abu Jaja, and this guy refused to take part in a debate chaired by Theo van Gogh because Theo van Gogh apparently had insulted Muslims. So Theo called me and said he had been removed from the debate, and there was a politician, a member of parliament, who had attacked Theo instead of attacking Abu Jaja. I was in New York at the time, and then when I went back, I said, well, why don't you're a filmmaker, why don't you make movies, comedies about the relationship between the multicultural society and Islam? And he said, you write me a script. And I said, I'm not a script writer. I'm not going to do that. You are the filmmaker. You should do it. This went on for some time. And then I told him about a project that I was planning, but it was more of a museum art project. And I had spoken to a few museum directors. I called it Submission, and I wanted 4 women in different corners of a room with Quranic verses on their bodies. And the number, for example, the verse that says, beat your wife when she's disobedient, I wanted to give an estimate of how many women are victims of this edict. And he said, I can make that into a film. And he said, you just have to write me a script and you will see I'll adapt it. So that's how it came about.
But Ayaan, are you unnecessarily provocative? I mean, you know, the Quranic verses on a woman's body and things like that. I mean, are you just trying to be provocative?
I'm not just trying to be provocative, but I understand that provoking thought will ultimately lead to change. Maybe not in my lifetime, but at some time. After the attacks of the 11th September, European and American leaders called on to Muslims and said, please say this is not done in the name of my God. Please say this is not Islam. And I went to soul search and to self search, and I found out that what bin Laden and his followers were saying was Islamic, and that if we wanted peace, the only way to go about finding peace was to see what was wrong in the faith and then reform that.
So you think there's something wrong with Islam itself and not just how Muslim people live their lives or carry out Islam?
No, I make this distinction between Islam and Muslims, and within Islam there's something terribly wrong, and any attempt to change that will provoke people. So to go back to the question of provocation, that is going to provoke people. When I say it's written in the Quran that women should be beaten, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not provoking. It's written in there, and it's not me who puts that on the table. It's the man who beats his wife, using that verse as an excuse, as a moral justification of domestic violence, who puts that on the table. It's the man who takes a child bride and says, the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha and she was a 9-year-old. It's that man who's putting the Prophet at the center of the debate. It's for us who are brought up as Muslims to stand up and say, maybe in the 7th century that was fine, but today that is wrong. So the Prophet is morally wrong. That will be seen by, unfortunately, most Muslims as a provocation.
But you take it a bit farther. I mean, you've called the Prophet a tyrant. You've called him a pervert.
If you read it, that was an interview, and if you read the entire interview in its context, you will understand why I did that. The Prophet refused any sharing of power. He was the ultimate lawgiver, and he said he got through, the commands through revelation and through God. That today in the 21st century is how we define tyranny. Maybe in the 7th century that was accepted. And it's not me who's putting the Prophet again on the table, but it's those people who want now absolute power. And we see radical Islamists trying to bring about a caliphate in the example of the Prophet, who then make, at least borrow from the Prophet his tyrannical side.
You dedicate your book to your family and also to, quote, the millions and millions of Muslim women who have had to submit. What do you mean? Submit to what?
Submit to the will of Allah. That is compiled in the Quran, and its further worked out in the Hadith. It is to submit to total obedience, to submit to parents who give you away as child brides.
But isn't that different than submitting to God? I mean, what's wrong with submitting to God?
Well, it depends on how that is defined. If submitting to God, to you as a woman, is told you have to be completely obedient to your husband, you have to accept leaving school early, you have to work as to deny your intellectual capacities. To you, if that's your upbringing and you're told Islam, submission to the will of Allah for the woman means this, then there is something wrong with submission, isn't there?
In your book, you say that because I was born a woman, I could never become an adult. What does that mean?
It means that in Islam, a woman always needs a guardian. And the guardian is, first of all, her father. If her father passes away, then it's always her brother. If she has no brother or he's dead, then it's her uncle. But a woman alone cannot make decisions such as finding and deciding who she should marry. She cannot decide where to live without asking for permission. In fact, if you follow the true path of the Prophet Muhammad, a woman needs to ask permission to go out of the house. She needs permission from a guardian, either her father or her husband or her brother.
My guest is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a New York Times bestselling author. Currently, she's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. We're discussing her memoir called Infidel. Ayaan, why did you name your book Infidel?
Each and every time after the 11th of September, when I got engaged in this debate, and I would say, please, let's look at our own faith, let's reflect on it, let's change it, my fellow Muslims would call me an infidel. And I thought it's just high time I accept that as a title.
And so you actually call yourself an infidel?
I call myself an infidel because it seems that my fellow Muslims associate any form of progress with being an infidel. We can't change our minds. You can't say this, the Quran is written by human beings. Let's reflect on it. Let's, adapt it to our times. Then you're an infidel. The Prophet may have been wrong about this or that. You're an infidel. Women are treated badly in Islam. Complaining about that is equal to being an infidel. So it seemed as if any form of enlightenment was equated to being an infidel, and I think it's time that more and more of us become infidels.
What religion do you consider yourself now?
I'm not religious.
At all?
Not at all, no. And I think it's very important to say I'm not religious because that is, for me, that's the truth. I've come to understand that there's no hell, no heaven. I mean, when we die, like I think it was the philosopher Bertrand Russell who said, we're going to rot. There's no God, or at least there's no evidence that there is a God. And so there is, for me, to say I'm not religious.
You were born and raised in a Muslim family, originally from Somalia. Your mother was married off to a man that she didn't like and then was able to divorce him. That wasn't very typical for the culture, was it?
It's not typical for the culture, but it was something at that time in the, I think, early 60s that started to happen.
And your grandmother lived with you for quite some time. What was she like?
My grandmother was a very interesting woman. She was born in a nomadic context where she had camels and cows and sheep and goats, and she herded that, and she made her own homes, her own little huts. And then she comes from one moment to the next in a modern setting. She's been bred to understand and value the bloodline and the clan system. And as children born in a city, growing up in what was for us the modern world, she would only try and make us learn her world, starting with the bloodline, trying to understand which animals were dangerous and which animals were not dangerous, having us genitally mutilated because that was the only way we could find a husband. So for her values and her value system was so deeply ingrained in her that she passed that on to us with no mercy and with no understanding of the fact that our world had changed and had become different from hers.
Well, I want to ask you about that because it was your grandmother who had you circumcised at the age of 5.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, as I explain in the book, she decides at one point when my mother is not there, my father wasn't there to start with, she decides it's time to have the girls cleansed. That's the term she used, to cleanse, to purify. And then she got, fortunately, a man who wanted to do it, because if she had gotten a woman, the operation would have been far, far more worse than I describe in the book. And then she had all 3 of us, my brother, my sister, and I, in her eyes, purified. A technical term that is, or it is the vernacular that today, as a technical term has become, or as an active term has come to be called, female genital mutilation.
But why is it practiced in Somalia and other areas? Why? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, the main reason is to ensure that a bride is a virgin on the night that she's, the bridal night. And between childhood and adolescence, they think that if you cut the clitoris or part of the clitoris, that will decrease the sexuality of the female. That is what the 2 reasons that it's done.
And they also then sew up that whole area.
The sewing has to do with ensuring the virginity. So you have no premarital. It's the only way to ensure, and in nomadic societies it worked very well to ensure that there's no premarital sex. And if that is ruptured, then that is proof that there's been premarital sex, and that often doesn't go well for the girl.
Does it continue today, this practice?
Yes, 140 million women are mutilated in this way today worldwide. It predated Islam, and it happens today in areas that are not Islamic, but mainly the regions in the world that practice female genital mutilation are Islamic. And the only reason that they go on doing this is to ensure the virginity.
So are you blaming Islam for this practice?
Well, it's not so much blaming, it's pointless to blame. But what I'm trying to do is urge Muslims to think about this doctrine of virginity. Because if it's no longer required for a girl to have premarital sex, then the action to go and cut her clitoris and sew her up, the need to do that is going to disappear. But we have to get to the root causes of that. And I think it's the value system that finds that avoiding or preventing premarital sex is by mutilating its daughters.
That's Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a New York Times bestselling author, former member of the Dutch Parliament. In 2005, she was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The book we're discussing is called Infidel. You're listening to The Mimi Gerges Show on the web at mgshow.org. We'll be right back. In the late 70s, your father, who had been in prison for being a Somalian resistance fighter, escaped from prison, and your family moved to Saudi Arabia. Why there?
I think it was because it was the easiest way to go. And my mother had lived in Aden. She had lived in Kuwait. She spoke Arabic. And she thought if we went and lived in Mecca, we could escape the nightmare in Somalia. There was a dictatorship, there was a coup, and he had become a communist. Saudi Arabia was the land of abundance. It was the land of God for her. It was heaven. It was an oasis in a crazy world. And so my mother decided that would be the country that she wanted to live in.
What were your initial impressions of it?
I think the most striking for anyone who visits Saudi Arabia is the treatment of women. When we land, when we are not allowed into the country because there is no male guardian with us. Saudi Arabia is the only country, I think, besides Iran, where the law of Islam, Sharia, is actually implemented. The requirement that women cannot move around without male guardians is the first thing that strikes you when you come at the airport. She just wasn't helped with her 3 children.
I mean, is that in the Quran, that women can't move around without a guardian?
That's in the hadith. It's too much to explain here on the radio, but you have, in the Quran, you just have that women need guardians. That is worked out into a law. The Sharia is not really in the Quran, it's actually worked out in the hadith. But the broad lines of it are in the Quran.
At night, you could sometimes hear men beating their wives.
In Saudi Arabia, yes. Not only at night, even during the day. It's completely accepted. And I think that was another difference between Somalia and Saudi Arabia. In Somalia, wife beating, at least in the clans that I grew up in, and men beating women was considered something shameful. You could leave women. You could, if you didn't like your wife, get another wife. You could divorce her in Somalia. But beating was considered something beneath you. And in Saudi Arabia, it was common. It was, and again, it was justified in its, God has given me permission to beat her if she's disobedient. What I also thought was interesting, and again I saw it in the Netherlands when I was translating for women who are Muslims, was that women accepted it as well, saying, I'm sorry, I was disobedient. He had a right to beat me. There had been a survey even in Turkey recently where about 50% of the women who were polled actually said that at times it was right to beat women under certain circumstances by their husbands.
It was in Saudi Arabia that you and your sister told your father that you didn't want to be a girl anymore.
Yes, it wasn't fun being a girl in Saudi Arabia. We were not allowed to leave the house. We were confined to the home, and that's a Quranic order. And if you want to leave the house, then you have to have a male guardian with you. Now, my father was always away. My brother was just a little child and cannot play guardian unless he reaches the age of 15. He got to go with my father every time my father went out on his political meetings and to his work, and we didn't. And so our life consisted of the 4 walls at home, the 4 walls in the Quran school, and the 4 walls in the other school where we had a lot of religious teaching, and that was it. And so we thought being a girl just wasn't fun.
What did you learn in those schools?
Well, in the Quran school, you learn Quran. In the normal school, besides math and language, which was Arabic, we got a lot of religion. We got to read the Quran, then the meaning of the Quran, then the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, Sirah. Then we got to learn the Hadith and to understand it. Then we got to learn about the basic laws of Sharia. And so it was also, in Saudi Arabia, 2/3 of the curriculum was religious.
By 1980, your family had moved to Kenya, and your father ultimately left your mother and took another wife. How did that impact your family?
Most visible was his absence. And especially when we get into the ages of adolescence and, become, as my mother used to describe, as quite impossible. My brother drops out of school, my sister drops out of school, we are removed from our house. And these are the moments that it would have been very good if our father was there for us, and he wasn't. And this left my mother in a state of resentment towards him and very, very bitter. She was and still is very, very angry with him for those years that he simply wasn't there.
And she took it out on you and your brother and your sister?
She just took it out on her surroundings, and yes, we were around. We were part of it. I mean, she also broke the furniture, and she She could go from moments of deep depression to moments of rage. And in a way, I think I'm not excusing it and I'm not condoning my mother's behavior, but I could see the despair. I was a witness to it. And that prevents me from having any feelings of embitterment towards her. But just seeing how a woman can be so dependent. And so a woman's life, my mother's life, was directed by the circumstances. And the only lesson that I got from that, most important lesson, is that's not going to happen to me.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali is in the studio with me. We're discussing her memoir. It's called Infidel. Ayaan, when you were 16, you had a new teacher for Islamic education named Sister Aziza. What did she teach you about the role of women and Islam?
She emphasized that it was up to us, if we wanted to go to heaven in the hereafter and be close to God, to be obedient on earth. And that obedience constituted, once you got married, complete subservience to your husband, if your husband was an observing Muslim. So she made an exception. If he wasn't, you could disobey your husband only if he asked you not to pray or only if he led you astray from the path of God. And that obedience went very far. You could never tell him no, not even sexually, not even if you didn't like him, because going through that was what she called trial. You have life on earth in the Islamic context is trial. And when you pass it, it's like an exam. You have to go through it. You have to go through the obedience. You have to go through the obligations of praying 5 times a day and the fasting and so on. And all this is important because you'll get, as time moves on, good points. And then in the hereafter, that will be weighed. And the more points you have, the more accessible the way to heaven is.
What did she tell you about Jews?
She told us that Jews were responsible for whatever was going wrong with the Islamic world. She showed us pictures of what was going on in Iran. At the time, it was the Iran-Iraqi war, or just after that. And she said, look at all these people who are dying. Look at the children. We saw pictures of people being tortured, and the Jews were behind that. Sister Aziza saying this was not for me the first time to hear it. When we were living in Saudi Arabia, this was very, very common. I used to hear my mother curse at Jews. If my brother was, if he drove her crazy, my mother would say, she would call him a Jew.
And during all this time, you had never met a Jew?
No, that was also amazing because as a child growing up, it just leaves you to your imagination because we were told they are not people, they are jinns, they are evil spirits. They manifested themselves in the way that, people were being actually killed because the Jews wanted that and they were providing guns and so on. But they could also, to us as children, manifest themselves as temptation to do the wrong thing. So for a very long time, I used to think and expect that there was just this, big, aliens with a huge nose and right in the middle of their head that would open up and little Jews would come out and they would come and tempt us and make us do things that were haram, things that were forbidden. And this is not just something that only I experienced, but that is today huge propaganda that's been going on, state-financed propaganda that's been going on for a long time now.
It was around this time that you decided to become veiled, where only your face and your hands show. Why did you take that decision?
I wanted to go to heaven, of course. The way Sister Aziza...
But I think more importantly, you wanted to avoid hell. Because
Yes.
hell is very extremely descriptive.
Yes. Yes, and I believe that many of the... I really believe... that's for me, let me call it in my own progression in life. I found the concept of hell to be the most important obstacle to change. Every time I wanted to think through or ask a question, if hell was brought up, then I would just shut up. And I think that goes on for many, many others.
When you were 22, your father arranged for you to be married to a Somali living in Canada. What was your reaction to that news?
First shock, because I thought, my goodness, this is the end of my life. Before that, I don't know, I was young and I was, life was going somewhere. Marriage meant, in that sense, life stops. Because after that, you know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to get pregnant, you're going to have children, you're going to obey this husband forever and ever. And for me, it was, when I said life would stop, that for me would mean I would go through the same circle as my mother. When I met the man himself, I had no emotions whatsoever, complete indifference. Didn't feel any warmth to him, didn't even feel repelled, didn't feel any hatred, didn't get angry with him. It was just someone, complete stranger to me. And he left me cold.
But couldn't you have just refused? Couldn't you have just said, you know what, I'm not interested and I'm not going to do this? You're smiling. I guess not.
No, you can't do that. You can, at your own risk, of course. You can say, I'm not going to marry him, and then you will be kicked out of the house, you'll be kicked out of the clan, you'll be kicked out of the protection of the bloodline. And you have to then be self-supporting. When I came to the Netherlands, where there is law and order, where there is police that will really protect you, and a state that protects the rights of every individual, then for me as an individual, it became easier to say, I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to leave him. And I left him. Easier only in that sense, not easy in the, to my conscience and in my relation to my father and in my relation to my clan. That's something quite different. So I understand why thousands of Muslim women living in the West find it very, very difficult to leave situations that they haven't chosen for.
Once you did get to Holland, what were your initial impressions of the West? This was now your first time in Europe, in any Western country.
It was breathtaking. It started at the airport. I mean, it started with everything being just so well kept and so well taken care of. The human hand in every little corner. The streets were well kept. Men and women mixed freely, and women were not in the least covered. I mean, I came in the summer, short shirts, miniskirts in Germany, in Düsseldorf, and later in Holland. And all this didn't lead to the chaos that was professed by Sister Aziza and by my other Muslim teachers. The Westerners, the Dutch and the Germans, were non-Muslims. And so it was puzzling why, as Galo, as infidels, they lived in peace, in obvious prosperity, security, and freedom, whereas we, Muslims, who got the last messenger, the seal of prophets, were in complete chaos. And what I discovered in Holland, in the asylum seeker center I came to, was it was not only the Somalis who were suffering civil war and were coming to this tiny place called Holland, but it was Iranis, Iraqis, Afghanis, people from Azerbaijan. So why were we as Muslims fleeing in large numbers our countries to come to the infidel land? And what were the infidels doing right?
And how did you answer that question?
I took political science for 5 years. And I think that infidels have decided to separate the realm of religion from the realm of human reason, create secular societies in which they continually research, first of all, accept that there is always conflict among humans, and then create conditions that make that conflict bearable. Can't take the conflict completely away. America is not perfect, Europe is not perfect, but it is life here is far more easy and far more preferable than in any of the Muslim countries where they experiment with Sharia or where they have total Sharia, like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
How did your family react to your, number one, your flight to Holland and your refusal to marry the man that your father had married you off to?
Well, in a very, very predictable way, which was to disapprove. My father refused to talk to me, wrote me a terrible letter. My mother said to me, whatever happens, you are my daughter. I learned from my sister that everyone in Nairobi, all our Somali family, blamed her, A, for not bringing me up well enough to conform to the rules, and B, suspecting her and, having all sorts of conspiracy theories that she had encouraged me to go, whereas she didn't. She wouldn't. When she thought that I might leave, she in fact refused to say goodbye to me.
While you were in Holland, you had completed your university degree in political science. You had started working at a think tank, and then 9/11 happened. Talk about how that impacted you.
My first reaction, of course, was shock like everyone else. Then it was, oh my God, I hope it's not by Muslims. And then it was by Muslims. And then there was the reaction of the leaders. At the time, it was the current president, George Bush, and Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the UK, and in the Netherlands, the Prime Minister was Wim Kok. And all these guys were saying, please stand up and say, it's not done in the name of my religion, Islam is peace, and so on. So I started to look at what bin Laden was saying. What did he want? Because usually that's what terrorists, people who commit terrorist acts, they always put something on the table and say, we want this or that. And when I read what bin Laden said, I downloaded that from the internet. What I saw was that he had quotation after quotation from the Quran and from the Hadith. And I started to look them up. And I realized he's right. I recognized the prayer that Muhammad Atta, the lead guy in the Twin Towers, had with him, and I recognized it, and I said, well, this is Islam. And my reaction was, we should not deny that it has anything to do with Islam. As Muslims, we should acknowledge it and then just reflect on that and say, we don't want this. We don't want our religion to be this. And that is when fellow Muslims, started to call me infidel.
What did you think about the media coverage of 9/11 from the West?
I thought that it was confused. The first reaction, of course, was because we live in rational societies, what exactly do they want? And can we give them that? Then it has nothing to do with Islam. And I think that what happened was there was this confusion between strategy and facts. People who wanted to say, especially like the political leaders, who wanted to say, let us not alienate all Muslims. There are 1.2 billion of them. Let's not push them into the hands of bin Laden. By engaging them, made the mistake of denying that the acts themselves had anything to do with Islam. And that was the same thing happened within the media leadership.
Why did you decide to run for office in Holland?
I was invited by the Liberal Party, who said, everything that you've been writing about, the integration of Muslims, and especially the position of women in Muslims, we want you to come and say this in the parliament because you are a Muslim woman, because this is your background, and also because there is no point in the woman Nelly Cruz who invited me to parliament said there's no point in writing the obvious. Whatever publications you now produce will disappear into cupboards. But if you go stand up in parliament, you can actually take, propose measures, and you can keep the subject alive in parliament.
So what was your goals as a member of parliament?
Well, first and foremost, it was to create awareness for what was going on behind closed doors, what was happening to Muslim women and girls. Girls were being removed from school, and teachers were not even wondering where a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old was. There was genital mutilation going on in the kitchen tables during the summer vacations and sometimes outside. And the medical community and teachers and so on, they weren't just wondering, why has this little girl suddenly become so quiet? What's going on? Girls were being forced into marriage. There were honor killings. And all this was, kind of covered up because people did not want to stigmatize minorities. The second thing that I wanted to do was that if we wanted the assimilation of Muslims in Holland to become successful, instead of just becoming fixated on social economic conditions, we had to look at social cultural differences, such as religion, such as Islam. And in both of these areas, fortunately, I have succeeded in creating awareness and in having some measures put in place.
Now that you're in the United States, what do you hope to achieve now?
Well, what I'm doing is continuing, but then from a different point, from an academic point of view, that same awareness that I've been trying to get done in Europe, and I do that by writing. Infidel is, I try and tell my story so that fellow Muslims can see that I'm not attacking their religion, I'm not only provoking for the sake of provocation, but that there are incompatibilities between Islam and the open society. And also the book is a warning to people here in the West who take freedom for granted, that there is a reason why we are pouring in to the West and the conditions that we are living. And tribal closed societies are not something that you can, in the name of multiculturalism, say we have to preserve them and they're equal to Western culture. I think that's what I'm trying to do.
You're saying that all cultures are not all equal.
No, a closed culture that mutilates its children, removes girls from schools, forces couples into marriage is not equal to a culture that has done all it can to create institutions to preserve individual freedom, including that of girls and women and homosexuals and every human being.
But Ayaan, how do you draw the line between religion and what religion teaches and cultural practices?
I get this all the time, and I try to explain to people Islam was founded in an Arab desert tribal culture. And because of that, many of those tribal values have been incorporated and made religious. So that, in fact, when you separate the two, which I most likely want to, when you separate the two and say, for example, female genital mutilation is not religious, then you have an imam coming in and saying, yeah, but one has to remain a virgin and it's not explicitly forbidden, so you can use it. So there's just this debate within Islam that is taking place and that has to take place, that hasn't had, people didn't have the chance, because every time, in my case, I'm labeled an infidel, but I'm protected. And there are many people within Islamic countries who are not protected. And so most people who want that form of progress and who want to say, okay, let's skip to culture, what is culture, and let's see what is religion, and let's see what in religion we can change, those are the ones who get killed or shot or silenced in some way.
Do you think that it is possible to reform Islam at all, given that Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God, that Muhammad is the ultimate human example?
I think we can. If you accept the assumption that Muslims are individuals who are endowed with reason and who are able to change their minds when they learn of an alternative that is better, then I believe that Islam can be reformed. So the way Christianity was reformed, the way Judaism was reformed.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she's a New York Times bestselling author, former member of the Dutch Parliament. In 2005, she was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, currently a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The book is called Infidel, and it's published by Free Press. Ayaan, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Thank you.